move to the first section of my analysis, which is related to those two ideas, oppositional tactics and hegemonic strategies. In his theory of encoding and decoding visual signs, Stuart Hall outlines three positions or frameworks to reading visual messages and TV codes. The first one is the hegemonic dominant reading, which operates using dominant codes, encoded, for example, by the state media. The second is the negotiated position, where TV producers and viewers operate within the hegemonic discourse, but with some resistance and few exceptions to the rule. This position, called the negotiated position, transplanted in society, could be represented, for example, by unions and human rights associations who work within the hegemonic code but resist a little bit to it. While in Egyptian media during the 18 days, the negotiated position was adopted by private satellite channels such as Dream and Al Nahar. The third position, which I adopt, is the contrary or oppositional one, which bears an alternative and rather radical frame of reference. It is the only one, according to Stuart Hall, which is capable of articulating real resistance to both the first and second positions, the hegemonic and the negotiated one. As a decoder of these images, I consider myself in a situation of opposition, in the sense that I seek to expose the dystopian functions of the square encoded and promoted by two main players, SCAF and the Muslim Brothers, through public and private media. SCAF adopted a dominant hegemonic position while presenting and responding to images of the square. For example, SCAF claimed that atrocities committed against civilians were created using Photoshop images and were eventually committed by a mysterious third party. This image had a worldwide representation. Every place on earth, I think, know about what happened to this lady. The Muslim Brothers adopted a negotiated position during the whole year of 2011. I'll show you some other military police in Photoshop. This was claimed to be Photoshop, right? The Muslim Brothers adopted a negotiated position during the whole year of 2011. They worked in tandem with SCAF, but they sometimes resisted and modified their position in a way that reflected their own interests. Here, for example, those are images of the first referendum on the Constitution amendments, where the Muslim Brothers encouraged their constituencies to vote yes for the amendments. And we have seen that a year later, in June, they also encouraged their constituencies to vote no to some of the other amendments. I'm not saying this is bad or good. I'm saying this is a form of negotiation, a position of negotiation, and not a position of revolution, not a position of opposition. Strategies adopted by both the dominant and the negotiated positions are counterbalanced by tactiques adopted by the opposition position. Foucault's thought on the nature of power in terms of tensions between the global strategies and the local tactiques is revisited by one of my favorite sociologists, Michel de Certeau, who proposes a sociological reading of power relationships in everyday life, and how tensions between strategies and tactiques are exemplified by law and order on one hand, and mechanisms of resistance and discrete tricks, what he calls in French, and I couldn't find a better translation, des ruses silencieuses et subtiles, discrete tricks, on the other hand. My analysis of mechanisms of resistance, channeled through the internet and embodying the utopian dream of building a new Egypt free of dictatorship and corruption, is an attempt to explain how both utopian projects, the transcendental and the immanent one, generated and allowed from within and from without dystopian readings. As early as the first days of February 2011, before the fall of Mubarak, seeds of a dystopian reading of the square's functions were planted and promoted by anti-revolutionary groups, members of the former government, NDP supporters, as well as by Islamist groups such as the Salafists or the fundamentalists. I argue that later on, the Islamists, under the leadership of the Muslim Brothers, eventually succeeded in establishing a dystopian realm, which promoted the ideals of security and freedom on the surface, and set up, in reality, deeply rooted mechanisms of control, domination, and suppression of freedom. The shifts from the utopian discourse to the dystopian one are illustrated by the following images. This is a cartoon made by an optimistic cartoonist. His name is Samir, and this was published in March 2011, so a month after the fall of Mubarak. This was followed by a euphoric short period of time after Mubarak's downfall. I love this one. It says, installing freedom, copying files from Tunisia, and then cannot installing freedom, please remove Mubarak and try again. And then the last one, installing freedom has finished successfully. So it's humoristic, but at the same time, it brings hope. Right? So we're following the example of Tunisia, and now we're capable of freeing ourselves from a repressive regime. And then you can see another form of euphoria, the military and people hand in hand. Those are images of the first days after the fall of Mubarak. Of course, the population changed its position a few weeks later. From February 2011 until June 2012, SCAF ruled Egypt using techniques of repression, military trials, criminalization of protests and sit-ins, virginity inspection imposed on women activists by the military police, sheer violence against demonstrators, terror spread by professional snipers, politics of rumor promoted through state media, etc. This image, the people wants the regime to fall, from 2011, a dying protester, to 2012, a resurrected protester, started circulating online before the end of the year 2011 to mobilize the population against SCAF with the understanding that the regime the people wants to topple down this time is represented not only by the military council, but also by its loyal allies. SCAF was ruling with an iron fist, and its allies were silent in the face of SCAF's repression, in the hopes to achieve what they call the tamkeen. This is a very fundamental word in the Muslim Brothers literature. Literally, control over space. Tamkeen in Arabic means control over space. In Deleuzian words, tamkeen would be the re-territorialization of the political into the religious, under the leadership of the organization. Was the alliance between these two powers new to the demonstrators in Tahrir Square? Not really. In May 2011, a huge demonstration in the square was organized by secular forces chanting this: "Two betrayed the square, SCAF and the Muslim Brothers." So you can see it in different alternatives. So betray might be a very strong word. Some other words would be, we do not trust both SCAF and Muslim Brothers. Protesters voiced popular dissatisfaction with SCAF's rule and disagreement with the Muslim Brothers' appetite for power. My critique of the Muslim Brothers' conservative ideology is inspired by their chief neglect of human rights issues. No formal denunciation of military trials or violence against women was ever uttered by the organization and its political party. Most importantly, the neglect of SCAF's human rights abuses impinge on their perception of revolution as a radical call for freedom. So let's ask ourselves, what is the revolution in the first place? I will use Hannah Arendt. Political philosophy produced a body of definitions that one might take into account when defining a revolution. Before Hannah Arendt, Condorcet summed up the modern concept of revolution in these terms. The word revolutionary can be applied only to revolutions whose aim is freedom. Hannah Arendt adds to the idea of revolution the necessity of novelty, of grandeur and significance. I quote her, "Only where this pathos of novelty is present and where novelty is connected with the idea of freedom are we entitled to speak of revolution." As much as the concept of freedom itself remains abstract and intangible, the process of liberation, I argue, is rather tangible and crucial to understand in order to understand the necessity of movement, the development, and the outcome of a revolution. The question remains, did the Egyptian revolution achieve grandeur and significance? My answer would be definitely positive. Yet, Egyptians have all the reasons to be profoundly skeptical about novelty and change, whether they express it through humor, like again this cartoon by Sami Samir, the old and the new regime, the comparison between the old and the new, or what I call the new old regime. You see, I'm skeptical, but I keep my humor as well, and very optimistic. And it's not because I live abroad, because as an Egyptian, I'm also accused a little bit of this. You don't feel our suffering. Okay. Let's not get too personal here. As much as the concept of freedom itself remains abstract and intangible, the process of liberation is rather tangible and crucial to understand the necessity of movement, the development and the outcome of a revolution. Let's look at, of course, the comment made by those cartoons on the intervention of the United States, for instance, in the whole process. But let's also look at this demonstrations against the new government, which took place in October 19th, very recently, 2012, showing, of course, in the middle, as you can see, the poster, the half face of the former president and the half face of the new president. The frontiers between old and new are totally blurred by the reproduction of the same rules of governance, the appearance of thugs, and the choice to ignore facts and offer the same old explanations. For instance, again, the new old thugs that one could see in October 12th. Here, of course, those are very, very popular images on Facebook. You can see, for those of you who recognize the logo of the 6th of April movement in here, and all the explanations as well. So again, on the front page of the Muslim Brothers newspaper, of Al-Hurriya wal-Adala, this is what we have as an explanation. Again, the third party is back to the square. We're not responsible. For those people, you know, images speak. I don't have to comment on images, right? I'm not promoting a hatred discourse. I'm promoting a lucid discourse. I have to say lucid. Lucid. Thank you. Yeah. Just to look at those three positions we're talking about, hegemonic, negotiated, and oppositional, and decide for yourselves where do you want to work. Because we have, all of us need to work. If we have some utopian sensibility. In her analysis of the French Revolution, Hannah Arendt distinguishes between freedom and liberation, and considers liberation as a condition of freedom. Liberation is to be free from oppression, while the desire for freedom is a political way of life. And I quote her, "The point of the matter is that while the former, the desire to be free from oppression, could have been fulfilled under monarchical rulership," she's referring to the French Revolution, "the latter necessitated the formation of a new, or rather rediscovered form of government. It demanded the constitution of a republic." End of her quote. Is this possibly comparable to what happened in Egypt, were Egyptian revolutionary groups able to achieve liberation and try their hand at the foundation of freedom? One could argue that the ongoing process of liberation is hoped to strengthen the civil society, newly founded political parties, and unions at large. By the same token, the process of liberation permits and guarantees the interests of a conservative political body who introduces and strives to impose a new political order with an overwhelming religious and conservative shades. There is no reason for us to mistake civil rights for political freedom. For political freedom, generally speaking, means the right to be a participator in government. So maybe we are in the process of liberation, but we did not establish freedom, political freedom. Because, it's needless to say actually, that the revolutionary groups are far from being participators in government. And the government today is far from accomplishing political freedom, nor to show true respect to civil rights. The draft of the new constitution is but one example of this dreadful situation. It was published yesterday on the newspaper Al-Masri Al-Yawm. The saga of the new constitution is one of many examples of how the new political order expands its power and strives for encoding a new system of domination by exclusion. Civil society and human rights activists are the first to suffer the consequences of such a dramatic turnover. Let me then recapitulate. A quick assessment of both utopian projects. I identified them now in a different way. I started by saying transcendental and immanent, authoritarian and libertarian. Now let me call those utopian projects, or give them another adjective, bluntly, religious and secular. A quick assessment of both utopian projects will show us that both fail to fulfill the demand of the revolutionary groups: bread, freedom, social justice. They both bear the seeds of their dystopian transfiguration. The ideological polarization of the conflict resulted in a collective anxiety among the population and submerged the revolutionary groups into the conflict between the two most organized institutions sharing power. The collective anxiety can be summarized in one main question, ideological in nature. What will be the future of the Egyptian state? This is one of the cartoons which also circulated online at the very, very beginning of the year 2011, after Mubarak was toppled down. Are we going to build a new pyramid of, now that we toppled down autocracy, are we going to build a democracy or a theocracy? Very legitimate question. The question was also represented in many other ways now that Khaled Said, one of the pre-revolutionary martyrs, when Khaled Said in this image was capable of, triggering the revolution and help the revolutionary groups to get rid of Mubarak, would Mina Daniel, another martyr of the revolution who was killed by military forces in Maspero under Scaf's rule, get rid of Tantawi? This is another legitimate question in the sense of, we're not just talking about, are we going to build a theocracy, but are we going also to encourage the military regime to take over again and get away with it, which is happening? The Liberation Square stands as both the metaphorical and the concrete space of liberation, understood as a process rather than a horizon, especially in a situation where lack of freedom is still persistent today. The recent attempt to change Liberation Square's name into the Square of the Martyrs is but another indication of the problematic relationship between the Islamist Utopian project and the concept of liberation and/or freedom. Not only this project fails to fulfill the aims of the revolution by endorsing the process of liberation, but the ruling class supported and promoted by this project also employs the democratic apparatus, the rule of the majority, to weaken, if not to break and destroy, the revolutionary machine which recognized the legitimacy of the transcendental project and helped its leaders to rule through legislative and presidential elections. The rift that occurred on the commemoration day is not yet about to heal. It shattered the already fragile bonds between the revolutionaries and the Muslim brothers. between the libertarian, immanent, secular utopian project and the authoritarian, transcendental Islamist one. The first struggles in the hopes to establish political freedom. The latter is keen to reform and amend by stabilizing the status quo. Once again, nomos versus police, movement versus territorialization. I will move now to the second section of my presentation, which looks directly to utopian and dystopian functions of the square, how the square was represented under the both utopian and dystopian lights. Claes and Sargent define utopias as modes of cultural productions where good and bad imagined worlds are variants of the utopian thinking. The oscillation of utopian thinking, perceived, for example, in Thomas More's Utopia in 1516, is illustrated by tensions and oppositions between one mode of utopian thinking, which looks at the past and imagines it as different from or better than the present, and another mode of thinking that imagines utopia as the intentional product of rational action, the outcome of social engineering through which the good society might be realized in the future. Unlike utopian and dystopian unreal spaces, which exemplify the geographic and demographic ideals or counter-ideals, imagined by a philosopher like Plato, or a humanist and statesman like Thomas More, or even a novelist like George Orwell, the Liberation Square during the first episode, the 18 Days, offered a real space of liberation for a community of believers determined to lead the country towards real change. At least this was the horizon. Let me now examine the utopian functions of the square developed during the first episode in reaction to the virulent attacks perpetrated by the state media and police forces. The square, throughout this time, was the site of reconciliatory utopian projects. One could depict at least 4 utopian functions conferred to the square during this period. The first is what I can call the radical and pacifist criticism. The square condemned the faults of the nation, rose against established authority, and called for democratization. Thomas More's wish to describe not a society that could and should be created, but rather to point out to the English ruling classes the faults of their own nation. This wish by Thomas More was fulfilled by the Tahrir Utopian project with its 2 expressions, the secular and the religious, during the 18 days. This was never the call of one particular social group. Rather, it embraced the totality of the population and sought perfection, reconciliation, as a basic component of the revolutionary vision. Resistance tactics used were peaceful and nomadic in nature. No or very little violence in retaliation to police violence. Movement in and out of the square. Deterritorialization of the struggle in cyberspace and tools of communication, like cell phones. The second function would be the communal function. The square succeeded in creating a physical community or communal living, although ephemeral, socially and demographically changing, within which the revolutionary demands were pursued. This community occupied the square, or should we say, the squares of liberation throughout the country, and was joined by organized sub-communities such as the Ultras. There is a fantastic book that I came across this time when I went to buy books about graffitis of the Ultras. Fantastic because it could be, it offers actually a body of material to be researched and analyzed and so on, to try to understand what was the role of the Ultras throughout the whole process of liberation.